Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, and I'm joined today by the man, the myth, and the legend, the one who made apologetics funny and made comedy into an apologetic, Jay Dyer himself.
Thanks,
Jay,
man.
how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I like the introduction there. That's kind of funny.
Yeah. So I wanted to just, for my viewers, in case you don't know who Jay Dyer is, he has a really popular YouTube channel. He does Orthodox Apologetics. And Jay, you were a Roman Catholic for 10 years and a Protestant for a number of years, and then you converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. So just kind of start us out. Tell us about that. What made you decide to convert to Orthodoxy, and kind of give us your story?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was raised Baptist, and a lot of that that time growing up, we were not super serious about church. We kind of had phases where we would go often and then not go. My senior year of high school, I started getting a little more serious about religion. I was reading the Bible all the way through and attending a lot of evangelical Bible study groups, and had friends in a lot of different Protestant denominations. And so I was getting more serious. I wanted to study religion and philosophy at a more academic level. So I went to college to study that. Did a little bit of Bible school, Bible college, and then switched to secular university. And I got really into Reformed theology, Calvinism, and did that for many years, and started to have questions ultimately about the history of the church and the formation of the biblical canon. And at that time, back in about 2003, there weren't a whole lot of internet resources regarding Orthodoxy. It was primarily just, if you looked online, you would find a lot of debates between Roman Catholics and Protestants. So that was about all there was out there. There was maybe a couple Orthodox blogs, but I didn't know about those at the time. So got really immersed in the Catholic Protestant debate, and eventually kind of just studied my way out of Protestantism as a whole. Read a lot of books on the formation of the canon, read a lot of the church fathers, and kind of just took for granted a lot of the papal claims and the papal argumentations. And I didn't know a lot about papal forgeries or any of that kind of stuff. So I was kind of I guess you could say duped by some of those things, but I had good intentions. I really wanted to find the right church and, do the right thing. So I became Roman Catholic in 2003. And when you shift from Protestant to Roman Catholic, there's, I guess you say, a honeymoon phase. And then you start to realize there's a lot of issues in the Roman Catholic world that arise, I think, ultimately from questions of history and questions of theology. So it's both of those things at once. And as I've gotten older, I've more and more come to see that, it's not just ideology and theology at work. There's a lot of other historical, geopolitical factors as well. So I focus more and more on those things as time goes by, because I think when you're a young guy, you're very idealistic and you interpret things through the lens of the idealism of youth, and you don't understand geopolitical forces and factors and state actors and non-state actors that have a lot to do with the world of religion. And sometimes that's from the background. So the more I got into the geopolitics of Vatican II, the more I got into what I saw to be really irreconcilable issues between the pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II papal claims. I was just kind of in an existential crisis for several years. As a traditional Roman Catholic, went to the Latin Mass for many, many years throughout my 20s. And I finally heard about Orthodoxy, I think from somebody online and some online debates, and started looking at Antiochian churches around me. This is about 2006, 2007. But I was still very Thomistic in my thinking and kind of immersed in a lot of scholastic ideology. So I was interested in Orthodoxy, but I wasn't really ready to convert yet. It just didn't make sense to me yet. So I attended Orthodox Church for about a year with my girlfriend at the time, and we were both going to be catechized and married in the church back then. But I wasn't ready yet, so I kind of called all that off. I wasn't ready to be married yet either. So at the time it was difficult, but I think looking back, it was definitely the right decision, both the not getting married and and the decision not to convert yet, because, one thing that's different about Orthodoxy is that you're not, well, I mean, we want converts, but we don't want people to rush into it. So I made the mistake of rushing, I think, a couple times early on in my youth, not with bad intentions, but just with zeal without knowledge, I guess is a good way to put it, like Paul says. So, so I held off, and I kind of didn't know what to do for many, many years. I never became atheist or agnostic, but I was just kind of like, I don't know if I think Catholicism is true. I'm definitely not Protestant. I'm not Orthodox yet. And when you look into Orthodox, you start to realize, well, Orthodoxy has its own set of problems. Nowhere is going to be totally free of problems, but it's really, I think, a question of what are the problems. And if a problem is systemic, meaning that something like contradictions in the papacy, to me, that means that the system is not right. So we all have, problems of immorality, immoral clergy, and this kind of stuff. But if it's doctrinal and dogmatic contradictions, then we have another level of problem. And I just never saw that there was any possibility of that being reconciled within the Roman Catholic setting.
Right.
It didn't look to me like, after Benedict, Francis was doing anything but going even further than Vatican II. So for me, it was just pretty much done with Rome, I think in about 2007, 8. And I just kind of held off, and I didn't really go to any church for many years. And then about 2014, I started kind of gradually getting back into reading church fathers again. I read a lot of St. Maximus, and I was like, well, I'm gonna have to read Cappadocians at length. So I got really deep into reading all the Cappadocians, and I'd never really done that in my 20s. I'd mainly focused in my 20s on Latin church fathers. And I just kind of assumed, like a lot of Roman Catholics do, oh, well, all of that first 1,000 years is pretty much settled. We don't have to worry about that. The debate is just between Roman Catholics and Protestants. But the more that you get into church history, and the more you get into, the Eastern perspective on things, you start to realize that, as the Alexandria document recently admitted, there's a pretty good case for the Orthodox view. And I think that ultimately, I'm saying this is my view back in between 2008 to 2014. I just started getting more and more into Orthodox stuff, going back to church, going back to the liturgy, and eventually was received in 2017, 18, somewhere in there. So, to me, in terms of Christianity, I just don't really see any other possibility as to what Christianity could be. I don't see Protestantism or Rome as contenders at all for Christianity. So Christianity is true. It's got to be Orthodoxy, in my view. So, in the last several years, we've been kind of interacting with a lot of Islamic debates, a lot of Protestant debates, a lot of atheist debates, and some Roman Catholic stuff as well. And there really hasn't been anything since, 2014, 15 that I've heard that has swayed me in any other direction. So I feel like, this is, I don't know where else one would go. I mean, I feel like there's such significant, kind of foundational problems in, perennialist philosophy and atheist philosophy and Islamic philosophy that there's just not many other options out there. So unless one wanted to be just full on agnostic, I mean, you pretty much have Orthodoxy as kind of the world religion that's out there as the faithful expression of the religion that Christ handed down.
Amen. So you mentioned in there a little bit about geopolitics. How did you get into geopolitics? Because a lot of your best content is political things right now. You've been covering a lot of the so-called manosphere topics, kind of the red pill movement. You actually have a video called Red Pill Pros and Cons. So you've been covering that a lot. What's kind of gotten you into that political sphere? And you have a really awesome book, Esoteric Hollywood. Kind of walk us through how you got into that whole sphere.
Well, I had multiple interests. So back when I was doing my undergraduate work, I wanted to tie in philosophy and literature. So I was studying, my university didn't have a film degree, and they didn't have like a major. They might have had a minor, I don't remember, but They had philosophy and literature for grad school and a lot of film classes. And so I always was interested in theater and film. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be an actor, I wanted to be a comedian. So that was kind of my main interest. And then I think what happens is that the internet opened up a way for people to really just sort of be themselves online. And eventually, if you do that long enough, all of your interests, for me, at least for people like myself, maybe that those interests come out. So the entire time I was doing my undergrad, I had a lot of film classes. I was interested in movies and Hollywood and the philosophy of symbolism. So I wanted to combine all these things, and that's what I focused on in grad work, was studying propaganda and how Hollywood used propaganda. So that's kind of the basis for where the two books on Hollywood came from. Simultaneously to that, I was also studying geopolitics, and I would distinguish that from American politics, or these political disputes about red pill stuff. I mean, I know there's some overlap, but what I got into was really kind of history of empires, and I did a history degree as well. So I really found the big geopolitical stuff fascinating because, if you read a book like Tragedy and Hope, or, any of these other big geopolitical tomes, or if you read Oswald Spengler, or any of these people, you start to realize that, history plays into this as well. And again, that's what I'm trying to, I guess, convey with, the deeper I got into Vatican II, the issues behind Vatican II, is that you realize it's not all about theology. There are powerful interests that are really entwined with Vatican II,
Right.
particularly people in the American power structure, Time magazine people, Jesuits, CIA. These people have a very strong interest in making the Roman Catholic Church into a form of soft power. So I realized the more I studied Vatican II and all that, I was going to have to learn about, well, what does that mean, soft power? What is Brzezinski talking about when he's talking about using the Roman Catholic Church in this way? And all these different famous people you hear about, like Kissinger and Rockefeller, Brzezinski. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna have to go read these guys too. And that, again, it was just kind of like I have multiple interests, right? So I mean, I'm interested in Hollywood, I'm interested in geopolitics, I'm interested in theology and philosophy. So it wasn't planned, it just kind of all came out that I wanted to comment on all these topics, just because we're in the age now where that's where you can do that. You can kind of be your own talking head commentator. Nobody would have ever dreamt of something like this in the 90s. So here we are. And it just kind of was just the stuff that I'm interested in. So I started talking about the red pill stuff because I studied a lot of that a long time ago when it was first kind of popping on the scene in 2010. Or at least that instantiation of it, when books were coming out like The Mystery Method, and books were coming out like Neil Strauss's The Game, and people were talking about, learning social dynamics and this kind of stuff. And then that kind of turned into, that kind of evolved into other things beyond pickup stuff, more political men's rights stuff. I wasn't like an activist, but I listened to a lot of those podcasts and debates and discussions 10 years ago. So it's just another area of interest. And so if I've spent a lot of time reading or studying a topic, I like to comment on it. So that's why I did it. And it's a hot topic. Everybody's talking about it. So, and then that led to eventually going on Pearl's show. And so, it's kind of out there. I interviewed one of the Tates a couple of years ago before they got super big. So yeah, I just happen to kind of be adjacent to a lot of that stuff, but that's why I talked about it. Now, when it comes to straight up politics, I'm actually not that interested in it. Like Democrat, Republican politics, I don't really follow it, but I find that, the big meta political stuff a lot more interesting.
That makes sense. I'm kind of the same way. A friend of mine just recently posted a meme that was like him in 2008 talking about, we need to invade Iraq because they want democracy, and then him in 2010 saying they don't care about democracy, and then in 2012 saying, wait, I don't care about democracy, and then kind of going down until now he's Orthodox, and he's like, monarchy is the way.
Right.
So and that resonated with me as well. Like, I don't really care about American politics, but like the stuff you cover, the larger political narrative, is very interesting to me. And that's actually kind of how I discovered your show, was because I was interested in that.
Oh, okay.
But to be honest with you, a lot of the people that I would want to listen to, it was like there was all these kind of weird conspiracy theory type videos that would pop up, and I'm like, I just can't follow this. But your stuff is all very well grounded and really rooted in academic sources, so that I don't feel like I'm getting some kind of weird off the wall speculation.
Yeah, I think it's
Um,
okay to speculate. One comment on that real quick. I don't mean to cut
yeah,
you off,
sure.
but uh, because we're all going to, in our thought process and analysis, have some degree of areas of unknown. And so I think it's fine to have formulate theories, because again, it's just kind of unavoidable. But what I do try to do, as you say, is lecture from the big geopolitical power elite and their texts. So in that way, I'm not typically theorizing. If I do have a theory, I'll say it's a theory. But most of the time,
Right.
I'm just lecturing from those texts. And so I can, say pretty consistently that it's factual and not theoretical. But yeah, I do agree with you that, and one thing you learn as you get deeper into this stuff is that there are real conspiracies, but there's also a lot of disinformation, and it can get really complex. And sometimes it's very difficult to sift wheat from the chaff in terms of the noise of disinformation that's out there.
Right. So another thing you brought up was that you had come out of Tomism, and I was wondering, could you elaborate more on that? Like, what kind of influences led you out of Tomism? How did you come out of that? Because from my perspective, Thomism, I actually also came out of Thomism. I'm a convert from Catholicism.
Hmm.
So I'm really interested to hear kind of what your angle was on that.
Well, at first, when I heard a lot of the Orthodox critiques of Thomism, they were kind of weak, and they were built on just kind of flimsy things like, oh, we don't do scholasticism, we don't do logic. And back in 2007 and 8, I found all that very unconvincing, because I'd read enough of the church fathers in the East, like St. John Damascus, to know that, well, he uses very scholastic, logical, philosophical argumentation and approaches.
Right.
So it doesn't work to just kind of have this general broad hand waving approach. But then eventually Dr. Bradshaw put out the book Aristotle East and West, which I'd read his essays prior to the book coming out back in 2007 and 8. And I thought there were some really powerful critiques of Thomism, but I wasn't ready to commit to giving up Thomism yet in 2007 and 8, just on the basis of a few critiques. As I got deeper into studying absolute divine simplicity and the Roman Catholic perspective, and I basically read, as far as I'm aware, most of, if not all of, Bradshaw's philosophical theological papers and essays. And then when Aristotle East and West came out, I read that. And then I read other academic critiques of Thomism. And so I was finding the argumentation a lot more convincing. Then I realized, well, I'm going to have to go beyond Thomism. I have to go read the St. Gregory Palamas. So I decided I would have to just start working through the literature. So I read the Triads. I read Debate Dialogue with the Barlamites. Got into the 150 chapters. Read Apologetics Treatise on the Holy Spirit, the advanced copy of that. And I was just finding more and more the argumentation for the essence-centered distinction against the Thomistic position to be just irrefutable. So that was a kind of a side thing I was doing as I was reading through a lot of St. Maximus's literature back in 2014, 15, 16. And I was just basically, I think by about 2015, 16, I was pretty convinced that there wasn't going to be any Thomistic response, because it was committed to this approach. And I noticed that in a lot of the debates of the Thomists, they would ignore, and I think this is still the case, the dogmatic pronouncements. Because at the end of the day, in Roman Catholicism, it's not really a matter of, have whatever school you want. Well, the way that system's supposed to work is you're supposed to follow the dogmatic pronouncements first. And I think Bradshaw shows that the Fourth Lateran Council, which is dogmatic for Rome, adopts the Peter Lombard doctrine of simplicity, which is pretty strict. So if that's the dogma of Rome, I don't see how we can squeeze in these other later positions like Scotism and Thomism. And I mean, Thomism, I guess, is more consistent with the Lombard definition of simplicity or identity thesis. So for me, that combined with the dogmatized position that grace in Roman Catholic Church is created. I mean, it's a created supernatural accident in the soul. I mean, it's clear in a couple places in Denzinger, and it's clear in Ott. So that's the traditional position. I think it's just more honest to admit that than trying to, cope and come up with all these things. And coupled with that, it's just sort of like Thomists don't ever really respond to the last 500 years of argumentation. So I don't think in philosophy. So there's a lot of challenges to Thomistic notions of self-evidence and first principles, epistemic justification that Thomists just never care to answer, and they just ignore it. And then when I read Father Stan Eloy's Orthodox Dogmatics Volume 1, and like the first chapter is saying we don't do natural theology, we have natural revelation. I read that in, I think, 2016. That sealed the deal for me. I was like, yeah, exactly. That's answering a lot of these dilemmas that I've had for so long, because that's much more in line with kind of the presuppositional argumentation that I was reading, ironically, as a Calvinist. So I saw the Orthodox position as really, in many ways, harmonizing irreconcilable problems in Calvinism and Van Til and in Thomism and Roman Catholicism. So you have this Orthodox position that kind of seemed to have the best of both worlds.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So what is it, just kind of, first off, for anybody who doesn't know, can you just explain a little bit about what is the essence energy distinction, and also what is Lombard's view of divine simplicity, and why do you say that those things are not compatible with Thomism?
Right. So in the Fourth Lateran Council, when it cites Lombard by name, it says that it identifies the attributes with all identical amongst themselves and with the divine essence. And so this is known as a strict identity thesis, that God's love, wisdom, mercy, etc., are all identical to the divine essence, and even identical amongst themselves when you name them. So the problem with that is that it denies a real distinction between the attributes, and that would also be a real distinction. It denies a real distinction between God's essence and his actions. So that means the action of, for example, creating the world would be then synonymous with the divine essence. The divine essence is necessary, eternal, etc., unchanging. Then the action of creating the world is also, by extension, eternal, necessary, and unchanging. That would make an eternal world, which is precisely the argumentation of Aristotle. Aristotle argued that the world had to have a eternal actualizer. Now, Roman Catholic theology doesn't admit that, but yet we have so many places where even Roman Catholic philosophers like Dr. Fazer, basically in his book, Five Proofs, admitting that maybe we should adopt this kind of philosophical argumentation of eternal world. Well, this is just really surrendering Christianity at this point. So
Right.
it amounts to putting Hellenic philosophy and its principles above divine revelation. It puts Hellenic philosophy and its principles above the councils and their definition, particularly the Cappadocian clear as day teaching of the distinction between the essence and the energy. Letter 234 of Basil is very clear. And then, from that, you get St. Cyril very clearly demarcating the essence from the energy and pointing out that in the Eucharist, you partake of the deified, energized flesh. So the flesh of Christ in the Eucharist is the deified, energized flesh. In other words, energized by the uncreated energy. So Cyril's very clear about that. That's the theology that underlies Ephesus. This comes up again in the Sixth Council with Maximus making the essence energy distinction the basis for his Christological diophysitism and dioenergism. So Maximus's idea that there's diotheletism, that there's two wills, two energies, two natures, is premised on the essence energy distinction. If you read the dispute with Pyrrhus, that's really clear. And Roman Catholics were always just denying this and saying that, no, it's not a real distinction. The whole argumentation and disputation with Pyrrhus is based on it being a real distinction. And John Damascus in book 3, section 15 of On the Orthodox Faith takes all those same arguments from Maximus and then just teases them out in Christology. So once you understand that Christology necessitates the essence energy distinction, that's pretty much the open and shut case right there. So basically we have to have a reality that distinguishes different real distinctions between different actions and attributes in God. God can do different things. So for example, Palamas, when he argues with Barlaam, he says, when God rested on the seventh day, it means he stopped the work of creating. And if you have a theology of identity thesis that identifies action with essence, there's really no way to explain God ceasing to act or ceasing this act and doing some other thing. And this also underlies the denial of the theophanies. In Roman Catholic metaphysics, they consider the theophanies impossible, and so they have to be created holograms or angels. And yet we're told countless times in Scripture and in the patristic tradition that no, these are the angel of the Lord really is energetically present in time and space.
Right.
And if you realize that if there's not a problem, let me rephrase that. If it's not possible for the second person of the Godhead to energetically manifest in time and space in the Old Testament because of absolute divine simplicity, as many Roman Catholics argue, then there is no incarnation. You see, this it underdoes the whole theology of the incarnation, because the incarnation is the second person of the Godhead entering into a mode of being that the Father and the Spirit do not. And if God is reducible to and identical to actus purus, then you can't have actus purus entering into time and space in a mode of being that's really incarnate. It's a very simple point, and yet they will talk infinitely in circles to cope and get around this objection. But to me, that's a open and shut case, as well as the arguments that Barlaam has with St. Gregory Palamas, because Palamas says, well, let's just end this debate with asking about what we participate in. We all agree that we can't participate in the divine essence. So what is it that we're participating in? And if the answer from the Roman Catholic is that it's another creature, even if it's a supernatural creature, it's not good enough.
Right.
That's the Arian argument, that you can be saved by a creature. Palamas says, when Christ came, John 17, to give us a share in the glory that he had with the Father before the foundation of the world, that's a real sharing, and eternal glory is not a creature. End of debate.
So do you think that's why the West doesn't have very much talk about theosis?
Yes, in part. Yeah. I mean, the Catholic Catechism mentions it, and they've had this desire to want to revive this Eastern lung of the church and its ideas. But the whole argument throughout the post-Tridentine period was that the Eastern churches lack and have lost the fullness of the faith. And now we have Bishop Barron on videos saying the papal church needs to recover the fullness of the faith by finding the Eastern fathers and letting the Eastern lung of the church breathe. So you'll notice there's been a complete flip in the post-Tridentine counter-Reformation apologetics and dogmatization versus what we get in the Chieti document and the Alexandria document, now admitting all of the almost 90-95% of the objections of the Orthodox Church for the last 1,000 years. So to me, the Alexandria document is yet another nail in the coffin, because it's a papally approved theological commission admitting basically 90-95% of our arguments and points. So if that's the case, then Vatican I is false and the Roman Catholic Church is false.
Right. Exactly. You also mentioned about how you saw a lot of the Orthodox apologetics as bringing together kind of the best of both worlds with what you had experienced in Calvinism and Tomism. And I thought that was really interesting, because some of the other folks that I've interviewed on this show before have talked about how in their process of converting to Orthodoxy, what they actually found was that Orthodoxy was the fullness of everything that they loved about whatever they had been before, especially if it's a Christian, sect. So, could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, do you see Orthodoxy as kind of the fullness of what you had experienced when you were Reformed and Roman Catholic and all of that? And if so, kind of what are some ways in which you think Orthodoxy is the fullness of those other realities?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways you could approach this question. First, I would say is that we have to be very clear and precise that I'm not saying that just because there's a median position that it's necessarily right. In other words, centrism can also be wrong. So it's not true just because it's centrist. Somebody might misunderstand me as if I'm saying that, or, because I see this as a position between Rome and Protestantism, it's therefore true. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the elements in Catholicism that were correct and the elements within Protestantism that were correct I think, as you're pointing out, are really the fullness of those things are in Orthodox theology. So, we could think of things like criticisms of the papacy that the reformers had, the Orthodox had already had, right? And yet, criticisms that Roman Catholics would have of Protestants in terms of tradition, apostolic succession, Orthodoxy makes those same arguments and has that same critique. So,
Right.
a lot of those kinds of things, which probably your audience is familiar with, but you can get really nuanced as well and deep into areas, for example, where Van Til would critique Thomistic epistemology. Even though I don't think Van Til had the answer, I think he had good critiques, and he would make critiques that echo or are parallel. I don't think he read Staniloy, but I think Staniloy and Van Til both had critiques of Thomism that overlap. So, people can recognize good and bad arguments. And also we have to be clear too. A lot of people will make this fallacy. They'll say, oh, you're making the argument that the transcendental argument for God, that's a Calvinist argument. That's a genetic fallacy. So an argument is true or false, irrespective of its source. It has nothing to do with who made the argument. So
Right.
It wouldn't matter if Calvin or Aristotle made the argument. Calvin doesn't make the transcendental argument, but it wouldn't matter either way because the argument stands on its own. It's nothing to do with the source. That's, again, the genetic fallacy. Oh, it's wrong because it came from that person and I don't like that person or whatever. Aristotle makes arguments about causation and teleology that pass into tons of people in the Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox tradition. Are we going to say, oh, well, Aristotle was not a Christian, so therefore the arguments are all false? That's, again,
Right.
has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. So we have to be careful of genetic fallacy. That's a misunderstanding. But yeah, there's just so many different ways you could go about kind of addressing this issue. And then, one of the big ones was, which is related to essence and distinction, is filioque. And, I never saw either Roman Catholic or Protestant people really addressing this sufficiently. The closest thing I could think of to a sufficient addressing of the question was the Vatican clarification on the filioque, which came out in the 90s or 2000s, whenever that came out. The Vatican clarification on the filioque admits that at one point, as you get down throughout the document, it admits that there are still tensions between the Father as the sole cause versus the causal power of the Father being somehow shared or committed or transmitted to the Son. And the document admits that that's kind of a irreconcilable difference between the Council of Lyons in Florence and the Orthodox traditional Palamite and Photian approach. So, if Protestantism and Rome never sufficiently addressed that, and if I see that, for example, Constantinople I is really adopting pretty clearly the Cappadocian model of the Trinity, which is a sole source. The Father is the sole source. To me, that's, again, another kind of open and shut case where neither Protestantism nor Orthodoxy has really sufficiently dealt with or can deal with or answer this. And I would say for people who really want to go deeper into that, just watch the lectures from Dr. Bo Branson on that topic.
Awesome.
I think other things too you could mention as well, like the geopolitical power of the papacy. The Protestants critique that for a long time. That's actually against the canons. The ancient canons of the first 7 councils don't allow for the bishopric to become a giant state power, and yet that's what we have with papal states. And I'm well aware of all the Roman Catholic attempts to justify that, but it completely goes against the canons. So that's a thing that you would hear Luther or different Protestants perhaps bringing up, but that doesn't make Lutheranism and Protestantism true. So again, I would just constantly be finding kind of a midway between these positions. Think about works of supererogation, super abundant, great works of merit and all this kind of stuff. Indulgences that we have in the medieval Latin tradition.
Right.
Protestantism is critiquing that, and that's a great critique because we don't find that in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to jump over into Luther's, sola fide. So, because that's also not patristic. So if I find, well, once again, Orthodoxy's kind of got the correct middle ground here.
Awesome. Now, I also have some questions for you from our viewers, if that's all right.
Sure.
So the first one is actually, I just wanted to say that the vast majority of comments I got when I asked people if they had questions, the vast majority of people who wrote in didn't have questions. They just wanted to let me know that they really appreciate your content and that they've been following you for a long time. So a lot of the people following my stuff are also following your stuff and really appreciate it.
Can I ask you a question just out of curiosity?
Yeah, sure.
What was your Roman Catholic background? Were you a trad cat, Latin mass, or like what was your path?
Well, I was actually pretty nominal. So I didn't get into theology as a Roman Catholic. I was pretty nominal. I went to church every week. I wasn't like a twice a year Catholic, but I was kind of just very superficially Catholic. It wasn't that important to me. It was just kind of a part of my life. And then when I was still pretty young, I began the process of converting to Judaism, but somebody challenged me with the words of Christ in John chapter 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And I was really struck by that because I realized that all of the rabbis that I had been reading, they all said that Christians could still go to heaven by being good people, but Jesus said that if we don't follow him, then we don't have God. And I kind of had this Pascal's wager happen where I was like, well, if I leave Christianity for Judaism and it turns out I'm wrong, then I lose everything. If I stay a Christian and it turns out that the Jews are right, then I still get to go to heaven. So it seems like a no-brainer to stick around.
That's a good point.
So I decided, what's that?
Also, too, on that point, I mean, I'm not an expert on Judaism, but, to me, it looks like it's kind of all over the place. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's as many Judaisms as there are basically rabbis. So, you'll get told, oh, no, you really should be Orthodox Jew. That's the best way to be assuring your place in the afterlife, all the way down to, all the religions are just paths to God. I mean, so there's like really, it's very relativistic, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then I think they have an idea that you only ask your local rabbi and you do whatever he says. Right. Well, but what if my local rabbi contradicts the other local rabbi?
Exactly.
I mean? So it's very relativistic. And to me, it's like, I just don't see how that's coherent.
There's also a lot of political ideology that goes into Judaism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Zionism and these things that's very important to. Now, that's not to say that all Jews are Zionists. Obviously, there's Jews for Palestine and stuff, but there's just even then, though, you have this very interesting sort of political agenda that comes in, which is why you always see Jews involved in sort of social movements, because politics is very much very much a part of the Jewish life.
Well, I think you could argue the same with Roman Catholicism. It's the same with Roman Catholicism. Same with Protestantism in a lot of ways, and also the same with Islam. Islam becomes very political eventually too.
Yeah, definitely. From what I've studied, it seems like Islam is actually more of a political system even than it is a religion.
As we get more modern, it seems like that in a lot of ways.
Right. So that's always been very interesting to me. But so after that, I spent a time in Seventh-day Adventism, which is super cringe. But over time, what brought me out of Seventh-day Adventism was comparing Ellen G. White's statements to the Bible
Yeah.
and realizing that these things just can't be reconciled. And then I discovered that Ellen G. White had made a whole bunch of prophetic predictions that
False
never came to
predictions.
pass.
Right.
For example, she predicted that Britain was going to enter into the American Civil War, and that Britain's involvement would force the rest of the European nations to get involved, and that this would result in a global conflict that would, I don't know, cause a bunch of destruction and all this. And she said all that was going to happen. Well, obviously it didn't happen. So Adventists have all kinds of excuses why that's okay. But at the end of the day, sacred scripture says that if a prophet prophesies falsely,
correct,
one time you're supposed to put them to death. And not that I'm saying we should have put Ellen G. White to death, but I am saying that if God,
well, it shows she was a false prophet. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It shows she was a false prophet. And there's myriads of these
false. By the way, it's the same for the split off of Seventh-day Adventists, which is Jehovah's Witnesses, because
right,
Charles Taze Russell came out of SDA, and then between him and Judge what's his face, there's a whole bunch of false end times predictions as well, because he built Beth Sarum, which was supposed to be where King David would live in San Diego when he came back. It's basically this like 2-story $1 million giant house. And then what do you know, when David didn't come back, Judge what's his face ends up living there. Right.
Exactly. All kinds of these things. So then to kind of make a long story short, I started Freed Indeed Ministries mostly to try to win Seventh-day Adventists to the true gospel. So I was always debating Adventists, and at that time I was a Protestant. I actually became a Reformed Protestant.
Oh, okay.
Really into.
So you had a Reformed background like me?
I did.
Okay.
I got into theology there. I started going to. I went into I actually started seminary in an Adventist seminary, but then when I realized that I couldn't stay Adventist, I left and switched over to Liberty University. And I loved my time at Liberty, but I was always doing debates with Seventh-day Adventists, and I kept having this argument that I would bring up where I would say, well, Adventists claim to be the true church, but you guys weren't around until 1844. So where are all the Christians before 1844? And, that was actually a pretty good argument. It was really successful at getting Adventists to think. But the problem was that eventually I turned the argument around on myself and said, well, wait a second, where were all of the Calvinists before John Calvin? Where were all the Lutherans before Martin Luther? If I'm going to keep making this argument against Adventists, then I have to be intellectually consistent.
Right.
So I started studying church history a lot. And I have some cringe videos that are still up on YouTube where when I first started this, I think I read the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. And in one of those letters, he said something about predestination, and I just clung to that. And I was kind of telling people, see, look, the church fathers were Calvinists, so I'm going to find Calvinism all through the early church. Well, fast forward 5 years when I've been doing this study for a while, that's not what I found, predictably. So I ended up first becoming an Anglican, because it was just much more familiar to me.
What kind of Reformed were you? Reformed Baptist or like PCA?
I started out as a Reformed Baptist, but I found them to be very similar to Adventism culturally. And so I got turned off by that pretty fast. I joined a high church Presbyterian church, so they were liturgical, which I liked, but they were
I had that phase too.
Yeah. So I was in that for a while. I still have a lot of respect for Doug Wilson and the CREC guys, but over time I just couldn't stay there, because I was realizing more and more that you just can't find Calvinists in the early church.
Right.
and it's just not a consistent framework. And then after I got out of it, I started to realize how many philosophical problems there are and theological problems. But when I was in it, I couldn't see that. All I could see was that there was this huge polemical problem. And then really I converted to Orthodoxy. I wanted to convert to Orthodoxy, but I didn't feel ready yet. And then the big C happened, and all of the churches in my area shut down. And to be honest with you, I thought that was a really cowardly response. I
I
wrote a
agree.
letter
Yeah.
saying that I thought that it was just really cowardly, that I thought the churches should stand up, and basically if we got arrested, we got arrested, but we should stand up to the
Yeah.
the medical tyranny of they can't shut down church, was what I kept saying. Well, it just so happened that about 5 minutes from my house, there is an Orthodox church that never shut down and that basically had the same philosophy I did, that the government doesn't have the right to tell us to shut down. And they were really, the priest there, who's now my priest, Father Michael, was very intelligent. So he figured out that one of the things that you could do was have gatherings as long as they were outside. So he started holding the liturgy outside so that there was nothing they could do. We were still following the rules,
Right.
because we could have gatherings outside. So I started attending the Divine Liturgy, and the very first time I attended the Divine Liturgy, I was pretty much sold. I joined the church. I joined the church in 2020, and then I've been part of the Orthodox Church since then. So
Gotcha.
it's been a weird journey. It took me kind of a long time to get into Orthodoxy, but
Same here.
in a
Yeah,
weird
same
way,
here.
I thank God for COVID.
Yeah, same here.
Because
It took
that
me a
gave me
really
the
long
push.
time too. Yeah. I didn't really get back into it seriously, until 2013, 14. So yeah. My first exposure 2006, 7, and it probably took me, again, 10 years before I was like, I'll probably just go this route. So I
Right.
definitely understand the long-term conversion route. That was my approach.
Good. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. You and I have a lot in common. So that's pretty cool.
How long, if you don't mind me asking, and I'm
Yeah.
not trying to pinpoint, right? I'm just curious, like how long were you Reformed / Anglican before you got into Orthodoxy?
I was in the Reformed movement for about 3 years, and then I was Anglican for 2 years, and I probably would have stayed Anglican longer, except that when COVID happened and they shut down, that was it for me. That was really um, too big of a just cowardly movement. I couldn't live,
Yeah.
especially when there were, like, down in California, John MacArthur didn't shut down his church and was fighting against the state. And not that I endorse John MacArthur, I think that he does a lot of stuff wrong, but I was so taken aback by the fact that someone with no connection to the apostles whatsoever was clearly demonstrating a lot more courage than the people in this Anglican church, and really in any of the churches in my area except that Orthodox church. But the Anglicans were making a claim that they were the successors of the apostles, that they had all of these, martyrs in their history.
Were you part of was it like a conservative, like Calvinist Anglican, like a high church?
It was a very high church Anglicanism, and I was still a Calvinist, but I think that most of the people in the Anglican church I was at probably were not Calvinists.
Was it Reformed Anglican or like mainline Anglican?
It was Anglo-Catholic. It was Anglican Province of Christ the King. So I think that that's based in California, if I remember correctly, but very conservative, very traditional, and still but still open to Calvinist people. So it's not totally like against Calvinism, but definitely Calvinist
Anglicanism has had that history of kind of tolerating high and low church, Anglicans,
right,
and Calvinists, as you know. So yeah.
right. Which I think that to a certain extent, that's what draws a lot of people to it.
Mhm.
But I was telling somebody the one time that what draws you to Anglicanism is also what will eventually repulse you.
Right.
Because as you become more and more firm in your convictions, you'll start to realize that Anglicanism's big tent leaves a lot of room for, frankly, heresy to just pop up and run amok.
Right.
So the very things that make you want to be Anglican at first are the things that are going to make you not want to stay.
Said. That's well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So another question I got, which I can't pronounce this guy's name because it's Greek, but he asked if you could explain the meaning of the 1,000-year reign of Christ in the book of Revelation.
I think the 1,000-year reign post Constantinopolitan Creed has to be understood spiritually. So just as God doesn't literally own the cattle on 1,000 hills, and then the cattle that's number 1,001 he doesn't own. So likewise, the 1,000 years is not a literal time frame, but a common usage in Scripture for just a really long time. So I think that the kingdom is clearly set up at the first advent. The kingdom is the church, and that's why the resurrection that's spoken of is baptism, the first resurrection. Second resurrection is bodily resurrection. So, when Constantinopolitan Council number 1 in 381, when it clarifies in the creed, whose kingdom shall have no end, that's added to exclude Chiliasm or literal millennialist interpretations. So as Orthodox, it's not permissible to think that it's a literal 1,000 years. You could potentially conceivably be postmillennial, because postmillennialism doesn't necessitate 1,000 years. It just argues that Christ comes at the end of the 1,000-year reign, which I think is true. And the real difference between amill and postmill would be whether or not things have the world gets Christianized prior to the return, or it doesn't and things get worse. So that's really the essential difference between those two. And I think both of those are potential positions in the Orthodox view, because they're not chiliastic. So that's and I would say that there's a lot of other texts and things you can read too,
right,
make it pretty clear that when Jesus came, he set up the kingdom. And so if Jesus' kingdom is 1,000 years, well, did the world end, or did he come back in the year 1033? No. So clearly it's not a literal 1,000 years.
Right. Now, speaking of postmill, you actually studied at Bonson Seminary, right?
Yeah, I still have all my post-mill stuff up there. I've got, Gary North, and I've got Bonson, Rushdoony, Ken Gentry books, David Chilton books. A lot of those books are still useful, still very good. David Chilton's commentary on Revelation is really good. And you mentioned the Doug Wilson stuff. I just not too long ago bought Lightheart's 2-volume commentary on Revelation,
Nice.
which is over there. So, or it's over there. So, but yeah, I mean, I think there's value in those commentaries and whatnot. Some of those books, but I don't think that, like you said, ultimately their ecclesiology and the historicity and, the big issues like essence energy and filioque, like they have no idea about any of that stuff. So,
right.
Yeah, I just think it's completely ahistorical and unworkable. I mean, how can you have within the same church, Reformed Baptists who will not commune their children and paedo communion people right next to them?
Right.
I mean, was paedo communion optional in the first 1,000 years of Christianity? No.
No. Right.
Just
Exactly.
makes no sense. So yeah, the whole Doug
Exactly.
Wilson thing is kind of silly, but a lot of people, it funnels a lot of people to Orthodoxy.
Right. It does. It definitely does. Now, it's interesting because one of the questions I got was actually a guy named James who's Orthodox curious, but he's Presbyterian, and he was actually asking what your thoughts were on postmillennialism. So you mentioned that it can be, it can be held within Orthodoxy. Do you feel that there's a strong case for postmillennialism in Orthodoxy, or what do you think is kind of, where would you go with that? I think that there's a pretty good case for at least some kind of maybe what they call optimistic eschatology, but what are your
Yeah, I'm
thoughts on that?
open-minded. I don't know. I mean, it's just really hard to say. And there's a lot of areas of scripture that I don't understand. So it would be presumptuous of me to, try to get really dogmatic about it. I mean, it's possible that, for example, if we have an optimistic eschatology, let's say something like the conversion of the Jews, which I do think is a future event. If that occurred, and Paul's prediction in Romans 11 of the world converting as a result of that, that might be something that happens quick.
Right.
Maybe within a few years, there's some, worldwide conversion, and that fulfills things like Zechariah 14, right? Perhaps Zechariah 14 is just fulfilled in a spiritual sense throughout the history of the church. It seems to speak of kind of a worldwide thing, and nations that don't convert or submit experiencing cursing and punishment. So it can't be eschatological. You don't get blessings and cursings in the eschaton,
Right,
because history is done. So it seems to presuppose some kind of still historical process and phenomena going on. But so, there's different ways to read and interpret Zechariah 14. So it's just, there's a lot of things that are I just don't have the answer to. So, maybe 20 years from now, if I, God willing, have been given more scriptural enlightenment and discernment, maybe then I'd have a better answer. But I think as you go, you more and more learn how much you don't know. So
right.
I would say, yeah, I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I would hesitate to say whether I don't know.
That's probably
I'm
a
open.
good.
I mean, I'm open to, I hope there's the world continues for 10,000 years and we get 10,000 more years of people converting. I mean, that's
Right.
more people in heaven, right? So yeah, that sounds good.
Right.
Certainly I hope it's not the end of the world and we're not going into some beast system right now. So I hope that the optimistic view is correct. But also at the same time, if it's not, then that's God's will. So whatever.
Right. God will get us through whatever happens. So now do you think that maybe, I don't know how to ask this question, it's going to come out weird, I think, but do you think that there's maybe a problem within Christianity broadly, and maybe even Orthodoxy specifically, of kind of reading too much into current events and seeing the book of Revelation unfold, so to speak, where you're kind of reading the newspaper through the lens of Revelation?
Yeah, eisegesis. Yeah, I think that that could plague anybody. I mean, I've seen it in Roman Catholic traditional circles. I've seen it in Protestant evangelical circles. And I've seen it in Orthodox circles as well. So sure.
Yeah. I have a friend, kind of a loose connection, but he converted to Orthodoxy, and now he's always posting about like this Russian nationalist stuff. And he's an American, but he's just super into Russian nationalism, and that's fine. But it's just funny because he's got this kind of like Russia-centric end times speculation going on. Where...
Yeah, I've always been hesitant about any of that kind of stuff. I mean, because I've seen a lot of people get burned with that kind of stuff over the years. So yeah.
But I think he's a sincere guy. I can't see that particular thing.
I mean,
so
if that happens, then okay, I guess that's cool, right? I mean,
right.
Whatever, but yeah, I'm hesitant about a lot of that stuff.
Right. Which I think is good, because since you're a person who studies a lot about politics, I can imagine that it would be tempting to start to kind of pull in some of these things. You know, you're into theology, you're into politics. It's like this could easily blend, right?
Yeah, but I mean, there's also a lot of, you know, people get duped and conned by a lot of that stuff. So yeah.
Right. Exactly. So the same guy with the Greek name did also want to know, speaking of kind of the end time stuff, he wants to know if you could explain the connection between the marriage supper of the Lamb and the Eucharist, because I think he's getting at that he's a little bit confused about whether the marriage supper of the Lamb is supposed to be seen as an eschatological
Yeah,
event.
it's a both and.
Or
So
the
all of the
Eucharist.
things that are eschatological are also in the here and the now. So this in theology is called already not yet. So everything that is described, for example, the book of Revelation about partaking of the marriage feast, that's the divine liturgy. And if you read the Gospels, you know, Jesus making that clear when he's talking to the apostles about, I will sit with you, you know, eating in the kingdom and judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's the history of the church, Christ amongst the apostles in the liturgy, in the marriage feast. So the marriage feast is the divine liturgy, and it's also an eschatological event too. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And I don't recommend Roman Catholic stuff typically, but you know, Scott Hahn's book, Marriage Supper of the Lamb, the basic idea there is Orthodox.
Nice. Okay. And James wants to know, where do you get your awesome 80s Miami Vice kind of attire?
Where do I buy that? Like, I guess just whenever I go to a store and I find a shirt that I think is exceedingly garish and ugly, I buy it. So it's not one place. I just kind of get it wherever. And then it kind of turned into its own thing where then my family members and people just buy me. They're, oh, this looks like Jay, I'll buy that for him. So it just kind of turned into its own. So sometimes things just kind of take on a life of their own. So, you know, I just started kind of doing that when I moved to Florida in 2018. And then it kind of just stuck with it. So
yeah, he's gonna steal your look, man. He's gonna steal your look.
I don't care. That's okay.
I'm just playing.
I just like Florida and the beach and all that. So
nice.
Yeah.
That's cool. Now you live in the Midwest though, right?
Well, we bought a place in Florida, so we might be moving back down there.
Okay. Nice.
We have a house in Tennessee too. So
wow.
I'm outside Nashville, but we also I lived in Florida for a year in 2018 to see if I liked it, see if I wanted to move there. And then right after that, when I was thinking about moving there is when COVID happened. So everything kind of changed. And then I got a deal on a house in Tennessee. So I was like, well, I don't want to pass up that deal. So
right.
But then we wanted to be back in Florida because I don't like the Tennessee weather. I mean, I have a lot of friends and family that I like in Tennessee, but I would much rather be in Florida. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, we just need to sell a rental house that we have here before we can move down there.
That's cool. Yeah, I really love Florida too. I actually live in the Northwest, which I have to admit, I have grown to appreciate the Northwest a lot.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I really love the scenery. I really love the nature here. I don't really love the politics here.
Yeah.
Seattle and Portland pretty much dominate the Pacific Northwest, make it obnoxious. But like, if you can kind of look past all that and just enjoy your surroundings, you can go hiking all the time. You can go to
Tennessee. Yeah, Tennessee is really pretty for nature. I mean, it's got
nice.
But I mean, I grew up in Tennessee, so, and then I grew up in San Diego for teenage years in part, and then grew up back in Tennessee again. So I feel like I've had my share of woods and forests and lakes. So I'd rather be in beach climate than forest and lakes. And I mean, Tennessee gets ice storms and it's not any fun. So
I get you. I completely understand. Yeah, I've had a lot of fun trips to Miami, so I would definitely live in Florida, but
yeah, well, St. Augustine is where we got a place, and I mean it's a lot more it's a lot more chill than than Miami. It's the oldest city in America, so it feels like, if you've been to California, like Balboa Park or something, it feels like, 'cause
Right.
it's Spanish architecture, and so it's got like a Spanish pirate vibe, which is fun. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
St. Augustine, Florida. Wow. That's cool. Speaking of St. Augustine, a fellow
I'll do one
named
more, but I gotta head
Sean-
out pretty soon.
Sure thing. So this is the last one. A fellow named Sean
Mhm.
wants to know, since St. Augustine seems to get quite a bit wrong theologically, why do we in Orthodoxy still consider him a saint?
Well, he had the humility in the book to say that he submits the book on the Trinity to the judgment of the church. And, the later councils that mention his works, when they mention him as a saint, the Fifth Council, for example, I mean, they don't mention on the Trinity. They mention his anti-Manichaean works. So, the reality is, church fathers got things wrong independently. And getting things wrong is not, salvation is not mainly an IQ test. So the church adjudged his life of sanctity to cover for whatever theological, wrongs there were. So that's my answer to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
And thanks
Kevin.
again
Thank
for
you.
joining today. I appreciate your time. And everybody, please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. And I'm going to go ahead and include links in the description to Jay Dyer's YouTube channel, and also to where you can buy his book, Esoteric Hollywood. So
That's on my
definitely check
website.
those
Be sure
things
not
out.
to get it. Don't get it from Bezos and Amazon.
Yeah, get it from his website
Yeah.
directly.
Thank you.
Don't support the evil empire.
Exactly.
All
All right. Thanks,
God
Kevin.
bless.
Appreciate it. Great chat.
Bye.
Bye.